Dumelang, welcome back to Naming the Unspoken. I want to continue the conversation I've been having over the last couple of episodes around blackness, identity, language, and how differently we can experience ourselves depending on the spaces we move through. And in this episode, I want to sit with something that feels quite layered. That experience of feeling too black in some spaces and not black enough in others. And I think what makes it complicated is that those experiences can exist at the same time. Sometimes even in the same day. You leave one space feeling hyper visible. You feeling like your blackness entered the room before you did. Remember those experiences? And then you enter another space and suddenly you feel slightly out of place there too. And I think over time, you begin noticing how differently your blackness is received, depending on where you are. Not because your blackness changes, but because spaces do, because people do, and because history sits differently in different rooms. I think there are spaces where you suddenly become more aware of yourself. There are spaces where I become deeply aware of my blackness, not intellectually, not theoretically, I mean physically, in my body, in how I suddenly become aware of my hair, my language, my tone, my body, my emotional expression. So things that usually just feel natural suddenly become noticeable. And I think many Black people know this experience. So you walk into a room and suddenly you are aware that you are being read. Sometimes carefully, sometimes curiously, sometimes defensively. Have you ever felt that? That shift where you stop simply existing and start observing yourself through the room. And over time, you begin reading the room too. You begin anticipating reactions. You begin sensing what can be said, what cannot, how far can I go, how much of myself can the room hold. And this awareness becomes almost automatic. I wonder how many of us are carrying that kind of vigilance every day, even without fully noticing it anymore. I think this became especially pronounced for me during my training in Cape Town. I was often one of few Black people in certain spaces, and that experience shapes you. Because when you're one of few, you become very aware of how you are being received. I remember becoming aware of how I occupied spaces, how I spoke, how emotional I sounded, or how direct I was. I became aware of moments where my Blackness suddenly felt too present, too political, too confronting, too uncomfortable for the room. And often nobody explicitly says this, right? And that's the thing. Race is frequently communicated non-verbally, indirectly. Through the atmosphere, there's something in the room, there's something in the air, through the body language, through silences, through what gets engaged, discussed, and what gets avoided. Have you ever felt a room pull away from something without actually naming it? Have you ever felt yourself become smaller in a space just so things could remain comfortable? And after a while, you become fluent in reading those shifts. I think many Black people become incredibly skilled at adaptation. We learn how to move between worlds. We learn how to soften ourselves. We even learn how to code switch, how to make ourselves digestible. Sometimes we laugh differently in certain spaces. We speak differently in certain spaces. We may even dress differently, even think differently. And I don't say this with judgment. I think often it's survival, especially when your education, your career, your livelihood, your safety depends on your ability to navigate those systems, right? Those systems that were not built with you in mind, with you, Black child, in mind. However, adaptation has a cost because after a while, you begin wondering about the distance between different versions of yourself: the professional self, the academic self, the self at home, the self with other Black people, even the self with self. And I wonder whether many of us have become so good at adapting that we no longer notice when we are performing. Who are you in spaces where you feel completely at ease? And who do you become in spaces where you feel like you are being observed? How much energy actually goes into managing how you are received? And I think many Black people carry fatigue from constantly translating themselves. But I also want to say this: that is not the whole story. Because when I think about Blackness, I don't only think about adaptation. I also think about presence, about strength, about people who walk into spaces that were never built for them and they refuse to shrink. They refuse to soften themselves into comfort. They refuse to disappear. And I think sometimes we forget that part. We speak about Blackness mainly through pain, through oppression, through survival. But there is also pride. There is fierceness. There is courage. There is something beautiful, something powerful about fully occupying yourself, about walking into a room without apologizing for your presence there, about speaking without constantly reshaping yourself to make others comfortable. And I think many of us know people like that. People whose Blackness felt alive, it felt grounded, unafraid, the kind of presence that shifts a room, not because it is loud, but because it refuses to collapse. And maybe part of this conversation is also asking, what would it mean to stop only surviving in these spaces and to fully arrive in them? What would it mean to occupy ourselves more fully? To stop translating every part of who we are? To recognize that our blackness is not only something that has been scrutinized, but also something that carries history, dignity, brilliance, resistance, and life. I've spoken in earlier episodes about language, and I think language is also sits inside this conversation because, as I've said before, English carries a lot, right? Um, English also changes things, especially in South Africa. So it carries a lot of history, it carries colonialism, education, history, access, mobility, power. Power is a big one. And for many of us, English became necessary. It became the language through which we could enter institutions, the universities, the professions. But I think sometimes it also creates distance. Distance from parts of ourselves, distance from home, distance from people we love. Have you ever noticed yourself speaking differently depending on who is around you? Or felt that certain parts of yourself emerge in one language but disappear in another? Because there are moments where you realize the language that gave you access also shifted how you are perceived by your own people. And that can feel complicated. I think this is the part many people speak less openly about, that there are moments where you can feel not black enough, especially when you have moved through institutions that historically were shaped by whiteness. Your speech changes, your references change, your worldview expands in certain ways, and sometimes you return home slightly an altered person, slightly changed by those spaces. So you return home familiar, but also aware of difference. As a Black woman, in my family, education changed my life profoundly. But I also think first generation Black professionals carry a very particular tension because you are often crossing worlds your family never had access to. And while that can bring pride, it can also create distance. Have you ever felt caught between worlds? Too much in one space and not enough in another? Have you ever returned home and realized that something about you had shifted? Not because you wanted to leave anyone behind, but because movement changes people. I think there is something painful in constantly negotiating belonging, in realizing identity is not always neat. And maybe this is why conversations on blackness become emotionally charged, because they touch something deeply human, the desire to feel fully understood, to feel at ease in your own body across spaces, to not constantly monitor yourself, to not constantly calculate how you are being received. I wonder what it would feel like to move through the world without that awareness, to simply arrive without needing to translate yourself. I think, I think what I'm trying to say in this episode is that Blackness is deeply complex. It is not singular. And perhaps maturity is allowing ourselves to hold the complexities honestly, the complexities around language, class, education, geography, family, history, opportunity, access. All of these, holding all of them honestly without immediately becoming either defensive or without trying to force a simple narrative about lived experience, without pretending we all experience blackness in exactly the same way. So maybe the question is not whose blackness is correct. Maybe the question is, can we stay curious about each other's experiences, even when they differ from our own? Maybe the question is not, am I too black or am I black enough? Maybe the deeper question is, what happens when blackness refuses to disappear, even in those spaces that struggle to hold it? What happens when we stop shrinking ourselves, making ourselves small? What happens? What happens when we stop translating every part of who we are? What happens when we allow ourselves to fully arrive? I think many of us know what it means to survive spaces, right? Many of us can relate to that. We understand that experience. But perhaps there is also something powerful in fully occupying ourselves within them, right? Fully occupying oneself within these spaces that we try to survive. That's something to think about, I think. So, fully occupying ourselves or coming as we fully are into these spaces, bringing ourselves as we are fully, not because we are untouched by history, but because we carry history with us. We carry lineage. We carry struggle, yes, but we carry so much power as well. And you know what? Maybe that is what blackness has always been. All of it. Presence, survival, memory, refusal. Lots to think about. Lots and lots to think about. Lesedi Khanya. See you on the next one.